That are here in the building and those online. It's again really nice to be with you all this evening and to continue our study of David. This is the fourth lesson of, the third lesson of David, and then obviously we looked at him with Saul as well. But we've been looking at David for a while, and the whole time that we've been looking at David, we would say that he was either the underdog or the on the back foot or in some sort of conflict or challenge situation. So this is in the latter part of 1 Samuel and then moving through to 2 Samuel chapter 10. And tonight we're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12. And in one ways, this should be the most stable period of David's life. We looked last week that he's finally ascended to the throne. We saw that he was firstly just the king of Judah. The other 11 tribes were effectively being governed by Saul's son in a hereditary transfer of power, but that he eventually becomes the king of all Israel, and that he has obviously external enemies that he's fighting, but we see in chapter 10 that Ammon and Syria are defeated. We're told in chapter 11 and verse 1 that it happened in the spring of the year at the time when kings go out to battle. But David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. So he's victorious on the battlefield. It seems like the nation is finally, settled and behind him. We've seen right throughout all of these difficulties, right throughout all of these troubled times, that he has remained faithful to God, whether it is, Philistine, whether it is Goliath in particular, whether it is Saul, whether it is the other internal fights that he's had. He's always seemed to behave honorably. We saw him acting honorably towards Saul. We saw him acting honorably towards Saul and Jonathan's relative last week in the chapter, acting without vengeance. And we come to chapter 11. And chapter 11 and chapter 12 are perhaps among the most famous of falling, the most famous of sin that we have recorded in all of Scripture. And in part, this is due to David's stature. In part, it is due to almost the size of the fall, that here he is so well presented, so well regarded, that we know, right throughout that David stands as this sort of iconic and almost towering figure throughout the Bible. And so to have incidents that we'll look at in some depth tonight, but I'm sure we're mostly quite familiar with the shocking and outrageous nature of this behavior, is to see such a gap, and no doubt makes it noteworthy. I think it's also important to recognize that the Bible isn't hagiography. So hagiography is just a fancy word for biography or writing about people that is only complimentary and often over the top. And so it might be, writing about a king, and you only record the victory, the battles that are victorious. So Sennacherib is a good example of this. We have recorded in the Bible defeat of Sennacherib. You can go to the Louvre in Paris and you can see a clay cylinder that has recordings of Sennacherib's time. You won't find his defeats there. You'll only find his victories and the good things that are done. And this goes all the way through, and I don't have to point out the flaws and follies of contemporary politicians, but you'll see that, whenever they get asked a difficult question, they'll answer the question they want to answer, the things that's positive. We talk about spin, these sorts of things. The idea of hagiography is that it's, an unreal an unreal positive impression of somebody. The Bible doesn't do that. We have Noah's great triumphs, but we also have Noah's folly, don't we? We have Samson's great victories. We have Samson's great troubles. We have Gideon leading great victories. We have Gideon showing great timidity. Here we have David. David, chapter after chapter, a man after God's own heart, clearly and in all circumstances of life, all these difficult circumstances. And yet almost when it becomes easier for him, almost when it becomes more settled, almost when you think he can finally relax, and when it might be less difficult to be a man after God's own heart, where it's more straightforward to follow God and to trust in God, when you're not having these constant threats and such a precarious life. And yet it seems at this moment is when he's most vulnerable. Because we're told in verse 2 that it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and he walked on the roof of the king's house. On the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him and lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and so she sent and told David and said, "I am with child." So we have here this very clear moment, don't we? We have David on a roof looking out. He's presented with the temptation to sin. He has choices to make. Sometimes we don't have all of the context here. Here we have this kind of very succinct but still clear picture. I think we all can understand what's going on here. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that we're never tempted beyond that which we're able. God doesn't present scenarios in which it is effectively impossible for us. They're very difficult circumstances, and there are times where we might say, well, the old rock and hard place, or these sorts of things, the great philosophical trolley problem, all these sorts of scenarios, we can run to the extremes. This isn't an extreme circumstance. This is a case of, as Peter would say, we have lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. Here we have lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, a tale as old as time presented. He has the choice to walk away. He has the choice to recognize that he should not be doing what he's doing at that moment, before he goes into all of these other things, before he inquires as to who she is, whatever it might be. He is in a scenario that he should not be in. And the scenario can only go further in one direction. But he can stop it here. When Christ defines adultery as not inquiring who that is, not inviting her to one's place, not inviting her to one's bedroom, not impregnating her, Christ defined adultery as being on that rooftop. He says, once you start looking, you've committed adultery. And so often we find people trying to find where the line for sin is, and how close can we shuffle up to it, and how can we define, and where are the loopholes? And Christ blows it out of the water. He says, stop looking for the loopholes. Once you start coveting, then you're stealing. Once you start lusting, then that's when sexual sin becomes your great problem. And of course, he isn't the only one to warn about this. Remember Solomon, he is warning a youth about the dangers. He's warning somebody who's at the very beginning of having to deal with these scenarios in one's life, and saying, it's going to be enticing, but there's a sting in the tail. There's all sorts of problems associated with immorality of this nature. Stop it early. And of course, we see David not doing that. And we see a very great warning for us in this exact same scenario. And by which I mean, you know, not many of us are going to be king looking out over and whatever else. Obviously, the problem of sexual immorality is something that goes through every generation. But it doesn't have to even be that. Whatever the sin is, there are moments where we can choose to pursue or we can choose to flee. And we need to do all that we can to flee. Again, Jesus makes this abundantly clear, doesn't he? Matthew chapter 18 and verse 8 and 9. Jesus says, I know sin's really hard, but it would be nice if you sort of try it as best you can, but I know you're going to fall. No, he doesn't say that. He says, if your arm is going to be responsible for you sinning, cut it off. If your eye is going to be responsible for you sinning, pluck it out. And again, he's exercising hyperbole here, the language device that I don't think he's arguing for bodily maiming, but he's saying, take this seriously, that we're not kidding around here, that there are lines here, and if you start edging up to them, you will cross over them. And with all of the admonition, with all of the warning, with all of the seriousness I can muster, you have to be careful of sin. It is better for you to lose a limb than it is to lose your soul. You can manage and function. It will be painful, but not as painful as the sin that so easily besets and entangles and crouches at the door. Here we have David encapsulating the choices we all have to make, the seriousness that confronts all of us, and the consequences that play out. And so the warning is, don't go on the roof. Don't, Christ says. And many people will challenge the Bible and challenge the church and say it's all about shame and it's all about guilt and it's all about, wowserism and all of these sorts of things. David's shame comes from his continued behavior. It doesn't come from God trying to rain on his parade or trying to prevent him from doing things or all of these sorts of things. And nor does it for us. God outlines the circumstances in which lust and all of these things are right and proper, and in an environment where they are the good and the right and the wholesome thing. David's not in one of those scenarios. David could be. David, we know, is married. David has children. David has a right and proper place. But what he's doing here is not right and proper. 1 Timothy chapter 6 in verse 11, it says, pursue righteousness. It's not just about the don't. He says, pursue righteousness. Remember when Christ spoke about the demons that came back stronger, that clean the house, and if you don't actually replace it with something else, if you don't, that temptation is going to come back. And obviously, for everyone it is something different. And that's why we're told that not just about fleeing sin, but replace it with pursuing righteousness, with good, with wholesome things. Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, it talks about admonition, talks about the ways in which we need to warn one another, the ways in which we need to say, hey, get off the roof. This is dangerous territory. This is where things begin, not where they end. And I know you can't see that because your mind's clouded or because you can only see some part of it, but I've been there and I know what it's like, or we have clear scenarios, clear warnings. And to admonish is really difficult, and I suspect it's not done nearly as often as perhaps it could, because I don't want to offend other people. We find it quite difficult to tell other people what to do. And I'm sure we all know that. I was listening to it's called a History This Week discussion, and one of them was about in 1964, the Surgeon General of America presenting on the news on a Saturday. He presented on a Saturday because he didn't want to spook the stock market, because he was about to announce that tobacco smoking was extremely dangerous for your health, and that they'd done a big review, and that who would have thought inhaling chemicals into your lungs had long-term consequences. In the room where they were deciding these things, half of the room were smokers at the time. Tobacco smoking was responsible for 1.25% of the US economy at that time. So to make that announcement, it's affecting a lot of farmers' lives. It has political implications for the US because a lot of them were southern farmers. It's the government telling people what not to do. In the year after that announcement, smoking rates went up because we don't like being told what to do, and we like to be in control of our own lives, and you're not going to tell me to stop. And the Marlboro Man is a rugged individual, and lots of advertising tells me that maybe all of those studies are wrong. Maybe inhaling chemicals deep into your lungs isn't actually that bad, and possibly it's a good thing. And look, here's this doctor telling you that it could be a good thing. Slightly sidetracked. The point being is that at times we have to have the courage to speak, and at times we have to have the humility to listen. And maybe that's just as hard as the courage to speak, to listen to someone telling us to get off the roof, to listen to telling your behavior is actually not in a godly direction, not pursuing righteousness, is dangerous for yourself, is dangerous for other people. And again, we ask, why is this important? Why bang on about this? Why be so overly dramatic? Well, sin begets sin. David didn't just practice infidelity. He didn't just make the life of Bathsheba a whole lot more difficult. And it's, again, there's the sexual sin component of it. There's also the power imbalance here. Does she have any capacity to say no to the king who's inviting her over? I would suggest very little capacity. So you could argue that there is an abuse of power here, apart from, again, the egregious nature of going against moral behaviour that's here. And so, of course, as I'm sure we're familiar with, after he finds out that she's pregnant, we have another choice. He's already pretty far into the muck. He can confront this. He can stop this. He can confess his sin at this point. Or maybe we can hide this. Maybe no one needs to know, and Bathsheba's not going to say anything because I'm the king and I'm pretty well known for killing people. So maybe if I recall Uriah, who happens to be, one of my elite soldiers. So not only have I abused a woman, but I've abused the wife of someone who is fighting for me, essentially under my command. So let's add deception into the mix, shall we? We're ticking off the box of things that God has made pretty plain are things that are far beyond the pale. And so when this doesn't work, deception has failed because Uriah, unlike David, acts nobly and acts responsibly. And when he comes from the battlefield, says, well, actually, my soldiers are there and I can't be, going back to my home life. I don't think this would be right and fair on them. So let's put drunkenness in the mix. Let's get Uriah drunk and let's try and deceive things, because alcohol always fixes things, doesn't it? Alcohol is never an accelerant for bad behavior. Alcohol never results in bad situations becoming a whole heap worse. And again, alcohol is one of these things where we argue a lot, don't we, about where are the limits, where are the measures, how far can I nudge up onto the line? And it's only those people that have, I don't have a problem, it's only those other people. Well, here we have one more example, if we needed one more example, of things becoming a whole lot worse when we try to include something that affects the brain and its decision-making capacity and its rational thought and all of these things. And when drunkenness doesn't work, we're in for a penny, we're in for a pound, so let's just go the whole way and let's just murder the fellow. And again, let's do it in a really deceptive way. Let's make it look like it was just a battlefield incident, because I don't want his blood on my hands and I can still hide with all of this, can't I? Your own soldier, the husband of the wife his wife, the woman whom you have abused. Do you think when David was on the roof and first looked upon a lady bathing and saw that she was beautiful, do you think that he would end up, do you think he thought that he would end up with the blood of one of his soldiers on his hands? Of course not. Does anybody think that they end up where they do at the beginning? We have this view, don't we, that maybe we're the exception. Maybe we'll be okay. Maybe we can skirt there. And maybe we can. Maybe we can hide. Maybe we can get away with it. Maybe the people who we don't want to know won't know. This is how it works, doesn't it? When Satan's described as, cunning, and when he's described as that wolf at the door that's prowling, it's not overt. It's not blaring lights. Look at me. It's bit by bit. It's the wedge. New Testament describes it as drifting, doesn't it? But this is our anchor. And once we start chipping away at it, once we start lifting it up a bit, once we start swaying, once we start, no, that's not so bad. No, I know, but, look, if everybody else says that it's okay, and the drift and the sway comes in, and we don't really notice much, do we? Because we're still, arm's length away from this, that, or the other. Again, not to, pick on things, but the alcoholic, the gambling addict, all of these things. And, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's actually successful. Maybe sin proves to be really successful in our lives. Maybe we can game the system for a while. But we know, don't we? And we know that God knows. And we know that Romans tells us that if our conscience is offended, it's a really good guide that you're in sin. When you're in sin, you're outside Christ. And when you're outside Christ, your soul is lost. And you really should have plucked out your eye, because it would have been a whole lot better than where you ended up. And do you think if David had have even literally plucked out his eye, and certainly metaphorically, things would have turned out better? Because not only did sin create a downward spiral for David, and not only did sin create a downward spiral for those around him, because sin has consequences and sin has ripple effects, and sin, once you start going, is often uncontrollable where these consequences end up. 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 14. However, because of this deed, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. The child also who is born to you shall surely die. I mean, when David's on the roof, does he think he's going to be responsible for a child dying? Let alone all of the things we've already mentioned? In 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verses 9 and 10, he's told, the sword shall never depart from your house because you have despised me. And it's true. And we'll have a look next week at how some of this plays out. But we see Amnon murdered. We see Absalom murdered. The reason that people stand up here, the reason that people preach, and the reason that people expound the Bible is to avoid situations like this. God is no fool. God doesn't tell us these things because of some sort of control, some taking away of our inborn freedoms. He tells us this because this is what sin looks like. And it might not always look as overwhelmingly dark and as bleak as this, but in its whole tenor, in the whole encapsulation of sin, in all of the ways in which we find ourselves against God, despising God, where at the end of chapter 11 and verse 27, we're told, and I've found studying this, just the economy of the language here, that these little half verses here and there that are so profound. And so news comes back that Uriah is dead and Bathsheba mourns. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And if the chapter ends there, you think, well, David's done it. He's covered his sin and, everything's all good, and he's even ended up with this beautiful lady. But the verse hasn't finished. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, as well it might. And so I have to confront myself and ask myself, what am I doing that displeases the Lord? And do I have opportunity to flee it? Where is my decision making all of this? Where is what I know to be wrong, but I put that aside for temporary pleasures, whatever it might be? Ever since Eve, the great battle is to convince the world that sin does not have consequences. It does. It just does. And anyone claiming anything else or diminishing it in any way needs to confront scenarios like this and needs to reconcile what's presented here for us. It has consequences now, and it has consequences eternally. And there's no philosophical argument or legal loophole or covering up that can challenge that. So what happens if we fail to stop it when it starts? Because we will. We do. David did, didn't he? And David, as we've seen, is amongst the most robust of characters in terms of faith in God and in terms of confronting challenges to one's faith in God. And yet here we have this great and almighty failing. So what do we do about it? How do we arrest it once it is there? Well, we know that by the grace of God, we're able to repent. And that's the most remarkable thing. And it's something we need to remember when we are overwhelmed by these things, is that there is a way out. There is an alternative. To David's great credit, and it's hard to find credit, certainly in chapter 11. And again, I hope we understand that we're in no way diminishing these things, or because he's David, it mustn't have been quite so bad. It was and is, and we need to be honest about that. But when he's confronted by Nathan acting on behalf of God, And we don't have time to go through all the details, but again, I'm sure we're familiar with, and if we're not, just the précis that I think, again, the detail does matter here, that Nathan just doesn't come up to him and say, you wicked sinner, you need to repent. Tells him a story, doesn't he? Gives him a parable. He gives him a story to run alongside. It's an effective measure, isn't it? It's why Christ uses these things as a way in, and so he gives a story of a fellow who has basically one sheep, and a fellow has lots of sheep and takes his one sheep because he doesn't want to use up what he has, and again abuses his position of power, punches down, we might say. And the really interesting thing is that David can see straight away the immorality of this. David is incensed by this. David says, where is this fellow? I'm going to bring the full weight of the law to this. And Nathan, in this great moment of clarity, says, you are the man. David couldn't see it in himself, could he? He could see it in this story he was told. What does that tell us about us? What does that tell us about me? What does that tell us about the dangers of sin? What does that tell us about our own perspective? What does it tell us about how we so often think we've got it all figured out, about self-righteousness, all of these things? David, for all of his great insight, for all of his great trust, he was either unwilling or unable, and probably a bit of both, to see it in himself when it mattered most, until somebody crashed the two together. And to his great credit, he acknowledges that. He could shoot the messenger. He could dig in further. I mean, he's already dug in a pretty far way. But he acknowledges his sin and he repents. And we have one of the great hymns to repentance in Psalm chapter 51. We could spend a whole probably month of Wednesday nights looking just at Psalm 51. But Psalm 51 is a confession of sin. Psalm 51 is a plea to God for forgiveness. In verse 17 of Psalm 51, we have David recognizing what's required of him. What do we do if we're confronted with sin in our lives? If we've been unable to flee it at its origins? We take on what he says in verse 17. We take on the sacrifices of God, which are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. I'm not sure about all the different translations, but isn't it remarkable that the same word is used here? That at the very end of chapter 11, we're told that God despised what he did. And here, we're told the opposite. We're told the counter. We're told what we need to do for God not to despise these things. And remarkably, it's the same thing that Christ argues, isn't it? And it's the same thing that Paul teaches. A sense of humility, a setting aside of the ego, of I want this and I'll have it. But rather to say, what I've done is wrong. And I need to make it right before God. And the payment that is needed, Christ has said, I'll pay that. What I want from you is to take on that. Do it in the waters of baptism, and do it in our daily turning back to God. Because this is a model for us. David here desires to be restored, to be clean, to regain joy. It's all the same language, the same principles, the same concepts that we have in the New Testament. The same thing that Peter writes about when we appeal to God for a clean conscience, when he describes us as being made whiter than snow and like the lamb. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with the language and the meaning of it. We need to flee. We need to flee temptation. We need to flee sin. And when we succumb, we need to come before God with a broken spirit and a contrite heart, seeking forgiveness and offering repentance. And so the questions that we need to ask are the how. How do we do this? How do we recognize? We've seen that David couldn't recognize until far, far, far too late. How do we know when to flee sin? And how do we put in place the things in our life in order to do that? And again, further down the track, how do we confront sin in our life? How do we confront it in the lives of our loved ones? How do we address these things and stop that spiral and stop the ripple out and stop the consequences as dire as we've seen tonight? This stuff matters. This stuff is important. This stuff is real world. And that's why we're addressing them now. Thanks very much to those online.